Part 2, Altered Consciousness. The main point of this lesson is that people have sought to enter into altered states of consciousness for thousands of years, primarily for the purpose of contacting God or spirits and for healing purposes. However, much of these practices are unscientific and ineffective and raise ethical considerations. Nevertheless, there may be some limited uses of dissociative states in the treatment of trauma. However, the key is in integrating and accepting those repressed memories and parts of ourselves into our normal consciousness. We're going to talk about this in more detail. So in this lesson, there are several learning objectives. You will be able to define flow and trance. You'll be able to describe ways people enter into flow or trance. You'll explain how hypnosis affects our consciousness. We'll compare and contrast two views of why hypnosis works. We'll describe how the workings of our consciousness can explain supernatural visitations. We'll describe the psychoanalytic and Gestalt theories of consciousness. And lastly, we'll be able to discuss the limitations in effectiveness as well as ethical considerations in altering our consciousness. So as you recall, there are different states of consciousness. Those include waking state and an altered state of consciousness. And the primary form of altered or primary altered state of consciousness that we regularly experience is sleep. Now, there is also a difference between awareness and consciousness. What's the difference? Awareness is about paying attention to our senses. And that's the base. And by the way, these are very connected. They're obviously oftentimes used interchangeably. I use them interchangeably, in fact. But there's a slight nuance in how they're used. Awareness is the basic foundation for consciousness. Awareness is paying attention to our senses and being able to pay attention, or being alert and recognizing what's going on. But consciousness is organizing and integrating the information we receive through our awareness. So some people believe that consciousness and awareness are virtually synonymous. However, like I said, they have slight nuance differences. Consciousness is the psychology of awareness. Awareness has to do with paying attention to our senses, while consciousness is more intentional about paying attention to what we perceive. So it's about organizing the information, like I said. It's about being intentional about it. Okay, one can be aware, but not fully conscious, while consciousness should lead to greater awareness. People who follow Buddhism and Eastern meditation, for example, believe that awareness is a prerequisite to consciousness, which has some spiritual implications. So let's talk about levels of awareness. As you recall, Freud talked about 3 different levels of awareness, which we'll revisit this again and again just to help you understand it. So Freud talked about the unconscious level. You remember he used the iceberg as an illustration. So the part of the iceberg under the water would represent the unconscious level. Then the preconscious is at the surface level. And that's because these parts of our memory or parts of ourselves can resurface. They can come into conscious awareness or they can go back under. So it's like the waves of the water. They can ripple. And then there's our conscious level. And that's basically our normal waking level of alertness and what we are paying attention to. So as I said, there are awakened state and altered states of consciousness. And there are also controlled processes as well as automatic processes. This is something to understand as well. So in our conscious awareness, we tend to have things that we have that require our focused attention, and those things that do not require focused attention. So controlled processes are those things that require our focused attention or complete awareness of. For example, if you're playing a game, you probably need to pay complete attention to that. On the other hand, there are things that don't require as much attention, don't require full awareness. For example, if you are going for a long drive and you start to zone out and think about other things, then the driving becomes automatic. And sometimes people will keep driving and they forget where they're going because they're so lost in thought. Or they might miss an exit because they're thinking about something else. That would be an automatic process because it doesn't require as much focused attention. Controlled processes are those things that require conscious attention to a fairly high degree, like driving a car, or having a conversation. While automatic processes require comparatively low level of conscious awareness, such as going for a walk or riding a bike if you're used to it. So again, that's controlled processes versus automatic processes. Taking that a step further is this concept of flow. Flow is a state of highly focused attention. So that would be going back to a control process. But this is a state of highly focused attention on a task at hand, which also involves a loss of self-consciousness and losing track of time. In a state of flow, people are less aware of hunger, fatigue, or even discomfort. This is because they may enjoy what they're doing, or they may actually be so caught up in something that they forget to eat, or they may forget to sleep, or they might not pay attention to pain. For example, athletes or people who are active, they may be so involved in something that they may actually hurt themselves and injure themselves because they're so caught up in what they're doing that they forget to actually stop and listen to their body. But this can be good. It can also be bad. It depends on how it affects you. But people who are in a state of flow are able to get things done. And now some people will use drugs to bring this on. And that's not good because, you want to have it naturally occur. Otherwise, if your body is in a constant state artificially, then it may need times where, your body needs a break. And so your body does need a break, and you don't want to always force it. Have you ever lost track of time? Think about this for a minute. Have you ever lost track of time? Have you ever missed a meal by accident? Have you ever tuned out your inner dialogue to pay attention to something else? Like, for example, you're listening to somebody talk, or you're so engrossed in a movie that you are no longer paying attention to your own concerns or things that you were ruminating about before. So that brings us to the subject of trance. We talked about flow, and a trance is like a step beyond that. It's like a dissociative state. The word trance comes from to cross over, to go across, or actually it comes from the series of words that comes from Latin. It was transferred into French and then into Middle English. So in the Latin, it literally meant to cross over, to go across. And then it also came to mean to be numb with fear. But then it got translated into Old French, meaning the fear of coming evil, or it may have also referred to people being in a coma, or it may have referred to the passage from life to death. So if you think about it this way, people who were in a coma were literally considered in the passage between life and death. And it then eventually just came to mean being in a trance as a shorthand word for all that. But literally, trance had a lot of deep significance. People associated it with the passage between life and death as being crossing over. So this idea that we are no longer fully awake. We're not fully cognizant or fully conscious. So an example of this would be with the Oracle of Delphi. In ancient Greece, the Oracle of Delphi, the Pythia, was the high priestess at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and was famous for going into spiritualistic trances. She spoke for the god Apollo and answered questions for the Greeks and foreign inquirers about colonization, religion, and power, and gave cryptic predictions. It's believed that her trances were likely induced by volcanic vents or by poppies. So this painting you see has a crack in the ground, and you can see she's standing above it, and there's vapors coming up. So some people believe that she brought on these trances by the use of a substance. But it's also other people believe that she might have brought it on herself as well. Shamanism is a practice that involves a practitioner known as a shaman to reach an altered state of consciousness or trance during a ritual in order to perceive and interact with what they believe to be a spirit world. So some people may use drugs or something to help them go into that state, but there may be some other method that involves being partially conscious or partially asleep. And so shamanism is this religious or spiritual practice that people use to enter into an altered state of consciousness or a trance. and that was primarily for spiritual reasons. So this picture is from 1914. It's of a shaman. And the caption said, Hamatsa shaman, possessed by supernatural power after having spent several days in the woods as part of an initiation ritual. A modern definition of a trance is that it is a half-conscious state, seemingly between sleeping and waking, in which a person is not self-aware and is either unresponsive to external stimuli or is selectively responsive to follow the directions of the person who induced the trance. And the ability to function voluntarily may be suspended. So people who are in a hypnotic trance, for example, may follow the instructions of somebody else. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't mean they lose voluntary function completely. They're still in control, but they might surrender it to the instructions of somebody else. And so that would be under a trance. A trance can be induced by hypnosis or entered by a medium. So like in the case of, the oracle or the shaman, they might have brought it on themselves. Trance states may occur involuntarily and unbidden. And so that's, oftentimes, we might actually go into trance states throughout our day and not even know it if we are so engrossed in something. That's why I was talking about flow at the beginning. People use concentrated meditation as a way to achieve a deep state of relaxation. This is done by concentrating on one repetitive stimulus so that all other thoughts and images are blocked out. So that's concentrated meditation. So if you were to, like, for example, if your mind is ruminating about something and you're having a hard time stopping thinking about it, then you might find it easier to focus on something and to pay attention to that. And that helps you to block out other things out of your mind. And some people who are having a hard time erasing a memory or getting a thought out of their head might find this as a helpful strategy. This narrowing of concentration, which is accompanied by deep, slow breathing, effectively reduces the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So if you're reducing the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, which is about the fight or flight response, it's going to result in lowering the heart rate and your breathing, and it's going to slow down metabolism. It might also help you to feel less anxious. So meditation has been used to help people cope with stress as well as to treat certain medical problems like drug addiction. In the Bible, the prophets also used altered states of consciousness as according to the text. We'll take a look at some of those. In the Bible, prophets were known for receiving inspiration through altered states of consciousness, such as through fasting, prayer, meditation, dreams, trances, and visions. And there's a list of texts you can look up if you're interested on that. I'll just show a few of these. For Christians, though, meditation is not about emptying the mind, like in concentrated meditation, but rather it's replacing negative thoughts with God's thoughts found in Scripture. So, well, you are focusing on something. You're just focusing on something that's found in Scripture. That way, it's a positive thought that you're replacing negative thoughts with. So here are some passages that you can find in the Bible that actually talk about entering into like an altered state of consciousness. So in Acts 10, the writer says he fell into a trance and he saw the sky opened up and an object like a great sheet coming down. In Acts 22, it says, I fell into a trance and I saw him saying to me. And then in Revelation, the Revelator writes, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. That's chapter 1, verse 10. And in chapter 4, verse 2, John writes, immediately I was in the Spirit. And later in chapter 17, he writes, and he carried me away in the Spirit. So there's this idea that he was in a different state of consciousness that was directed by the Spirit. Now, of course, Christians may want to decide or determine how that's done so that it's under the Spirit, not versus something else. So now that we know that people can enter into altered states of consciousness, whether it's through the use of drugs or induced, it brings us to the subject of mesmerism. Franz Anton Mesmer lived in 1734 to 1815, and he was a German doctor who theorized that natural energy was transferred between all objects in what he called animal magnetism, or later referred to as mesmerism. So he became so popular that 3,000 people came to see him per day at the peak of his popularity. So that's pretty amazing if you think about it. However, he became a national security threat, and that's why he was actually investigated. So mesmerism was so popular, or Mesmer was so popular that, like I said, it was a threat to their national security. So it was investigated by a commission of prominent scientists. In 1784, the French Royal Commission, appointed by Louis XVI, studied Mesmer's magnetic fluid theory and declared it a fraud, and they considered it was due to illusion or imagination. In 1826, though, the Royal Academy of Medicine in Paris studied the clinical potential of mesmerism. So while they believed that the fluid theory was already debunked, so they weren't really interested in that. But what they wanted to see was there still any clinical potential in how it could be used? And interestingly, when they researched it and they looked into it, they actually acknowledged that it did appear that people were sleepwalking. So some people were skeptical, but then when they saw how it changed people's states of consciousness, they realized something's going on here. So mesmerism actually still continued on despite the growth of skepticism. So skepticism continued on, it only grew, but so it hasn't really gone away. Instead, however, the way it's been explained has changed. So let's look at how mesmerism has continued to have influence. So it has had influence in the New Age movement. This is the Western appropriation of Eastern mystical traditions and spiritual practices that started in the 1970s. There's this common belief that there's a divine energy in people. That's because mesmerism, it comes under the category of vitalism. Vitalism is this idea that there's an esoteric energy that flows between all people. And the Eastern mystical traditions were somewhat compatible with that. So the New Agers synthesized all these and blended these ideas into the idea that we could tap into that energy and channel that. And so we see that in things like Reiki and other things. And there's crystals. People use crystals because it's supposed energy. It's also, mesmerism can also be seen in its influence in charm magic. This is the intention to use magic, supposedly, to control or manipulate a person, or to heal people through an incantation. And we still see similar modern pseudosciences, even still today. They include things like neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, and then methods of pickup artists. Pickup artists and people who use NLP, they try to refine and teach the use of words or linguistic methods. That's why it's called neuro-linguistic, meaning it uses words to change people. Now, NLP practitioners claim that they will have good purposes for this. Like they're oftentimes used in leadership training, and even therapists may use NLP to help people who are suffering from trauma. However, people who are like pickup artists will try to use these methods to do sexual partners. And these methods, unfortunately, lack scientific evidence, and they're oftentimes used to manipulate people. So that's some of the downsides about mesmerism. However, mesmerism has changed into having clinical use. There's some scientific uses of it. And so we're going to look at the history of hypnosis next. In 1843, the Scottish surgeon and scientist Dr. James Braid proposed the term hypnosis for a method derived from mesmerism. So remember, Anton Mesmer founded mesmerism, but Dr. James Braid took that and derived a scientific approach to it, and that's called hypnosis. As a scientist, Dr. Braid was skeptical of mesmerism, but when he looked into it, he found that people really did enter into a sleep state. So he researched it and he found, whoa, people are acting strange, and that could not be explained by the theory that this is just acting or that it was all a fraud. There's something going on. However, Dr. Baird rejected the theory of animal magnetism that the magnetizer had some special power over people. The idea of a magnetic force was already debunked as a pseudoscience. So instead, he argued a psychophysiological theory that people entered a state of nervous sleep, as he called it, or neurohypnosis, by using focused concentration. So it wasn't that people were some magic energy that had control over people, but rather there was a use of focused concentration that put people into an altered state of consciousness. So in Greek mythology, the word hypnosis comes from two things, hypnos and osis. In Greek mythology, Hypnos was the god and personification of sleep and was a twin brother of Thanatos, or death. So if you remember going back to coma, there's this idea of sleep, and there's the state of consciousness that's in the passage of death, on the way to death. Remember that, the coma or trance. So that's why there's twin brother, and so the Greek prefix hip is related to hypnos, and it literally means below or under. So the osis part implies a state that the person is in. So hypnosis literally means being in a state of sleep or being under a sleep state. Let's talk about some facts about hypnosis. There's a lot of misinformation and myths about it, and I'm not trying to promote hypnosis, just to be clear, but I think it's important for people to have factual information about it if they want to be able to understand it. So first of all, the induction of hypnosis always begins with focused attention. It's not, some people think that hypnosis is actually becoming drowsier or just becoming lazier with your attention. It's not actually it. In fact, if anything, it actually begins with focusing your attention. And so that's why people might use different techniques. However, you cannot be tricked into hypnosis. Only 5 to 10% of people are even easily hypnotized. And those people tend to be people who are more susceptible to dissociative states anyway. But you cannot trick somebody into hypnosis. They have to be voluntarily going into it. And while you might hear suggestions, you cannot be forced to do something completely against your will. Now, somebody might suggest that you do something, and that suggestion may feel very powerful to you, but ultimately you're always in control. And it's still up to you. And you may decide to do something because your desire is for it. But ultimately, it's your choice that allows you to do something. So what is hypnosis? We talked about the name, where it comes from. But hypnosis is defined as a state of consciousness in which a person is especially susceptible to suggestion. That is through external influence. Suggestion is external influence. One theory proposed by Pierre Janet and then modified by Ernst Hilgard suggested that the hypnotized person is in a state of dissociation, with one part of the brain unaware of the activities happening under hypnosis, and another part aware and simply watching what is happening, much like a hidden observer. So you might think of it as a trance. Dissociation is similar to similar to trance. The only difference in meaning is that dissociation is, some people think of it as a trauma trance. It's usually about disconnecting our reality. And so it's a description of the quality of being that comes with being in a trance. So here's a picture of Charcot as he was treating a patient who was diagnosed with hysteria. And Charcot was a popular neurologist who studied hypnosis, and he was also somebody that Freud studied with as well. Now, the social cognitive theory of hypnosis posits that people who are hypnotized are not in an altered state, but are simply playing the role that they feel is expected of them in a situation. So this is called a non-state theory. And so this is a belief that people are just fulfilling a social role that's expected of them. Now, there may be some truth in that. However, what cannot be denied by many people is that people who are hypnotized do sometimes appear to be under a different alternate state of consciousness. And so that would be these state theories of hypnosis. Hypnotherapy is a use of hypnosis by trained clinicians in which the mind is used to help with a variety of problems, such as breaking bad habits or coping with stress. However, there is scientific debate about whether there's empirical evidence that's proving its effectiveness. There are some people who swear by it, but a lot of research says the jury's still out on some of it. Now, how does hypnotherapy work? First of all, somebody has to be inducted into hypnosis, and there's 4 steps in a hypnotic induction. First, a person is told to focus on what is being said. Then a person is told to relax and feel tired. So again, it starts with concentration, focused concentration, but then they're told to relax, and then they're told to suggest or accept suggestions, and lastly, they're told to use vivid imagination. The vivid imagination helps them to take them into another area in their mind. Now, there's another method that is used more recently that's a derivative or derived from principles of hypnosis, but it doesn't require that somebody goes under a complete sleep state. So EMDR is called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a fairly new, non-traditional type of psychotherapy. In contrast to psychoanalysis, EMDR does not rely on talk therapy or medications. Instead, EMDR uses a patient's own rapid rhythmic eye movement. So if you recall, it's similar to how when you are sleeping, you have rapid eye movement. So the eye movement is supposed to help somebody enter into that different state of consciousness. So they use that rapid rhythmic eye movement. Now there's some debate about whether it's the eye movement that works, but that's the typical method. That's what they typically use. These eye movements dampen the power of emotionally charged memories of past traumatic events. So, it's important to, what people have found is that the best way to heal trauma, this is what Freud discovered, one of the best ways to heal trauma is to help people talk about it. Unfortunately, many times we repress those memories because it hurts so much. But when you try to talk about it, it can actually be traumatic and re-traumatize people. So that's why people don't want to talk about it. But EMDR is kind of like hypnosis, and that helps people to bypass that trauma. It helps them to be able to talk about something. So in contrast to hypnosis, where they're under a sleep state, EMDR, they're fully conscious, and yet they are allowed to, they're given the ability to talk about something that's very traumatic, but they're doing that because they're disassociating from it, essentially, by using their eyes or something else, like tapping. It helps them to disassociate just enough so they can talk about it, but without it re-traumatizing them. So EMDR avoids the risk of re-traumatizing patients. Now, going back to hypnosis, I want to look at how psychoanalysis developed and why did it look at the unconscious mind. This is important. We've talked a lot about how psychoanalysis looks at the unconscious mind, but we haven't really talked in detail about why. Sigmund Freud, who lived in 1856 to 1939, was an Austrian neurologist who founded psychoanalysis, a talk therapy. He focused a lot on the unconscious mind and compared the mind to an iceberg. So as you recall, there's the 3 levels, the unconscious, preconscious, and the conscious levels. And that's why he used the iceberg. Now, sometimes traumatic memories are split off and repressed in our unconscious memories so that they hurt us less. However, sometimes these memories will surface into our conscious awareness without warning. And that's why it's important to help people process them as they are ready. And Freud found that people found healing simply by talking about it. People of Freud's time were interested in women diagnosed with hysteria, which is an outdated diagnosis which is now known as a conversion disorder. But it was thought to manifest itself in women with a variety of symptoms. Here's a picture of a woman who is considered hysterical. The word originates from the Greek word for uterus, or hysteria, And the term hysterical suffocation literally meant a feeling of heat and inability to breathe. It was a term that was sometimes applied to women who had hysteria. So feeling of heat and inability to breathe. And so this was considered a disorder of women. It was thought to manifest itself in women. That's why it was called, it's female hysteria, with a variety of symptoms, including anxiety, shortness of breath, fainting, insomnia, irritability, nervousness, as well as sexually forward behavior. Now, Freud wrote about Bertha Pappenheim, known as Anna O, who was a patient of Joseph Breuer, diagnosed with hysteria. And Anna O, or Bertha, Anna O was an Austrian Jewish feminist, and he wrote a lot about her. Her case led him to the belief that behavior was influenced by repressed sexuality in the unconscious mind, or i.e. forgotten sexual abuse. So as I was saying earlier, a lot of times people will repress traumatic memories and will put it in their unconscious mind. And so he found, or he believed, that this repression in our repression of memories into our unconscious mind would still influence our behavior. And so that's why he believed he wanted to look at the role of the unconscious. In his work with Anna O, Freud initially experimented with the use of hypnosis, but he abandoned it because of its use of suggestion or manipulation. He preferred the method of just allowing people to voluntarily talk freely without censorship, and he called this free association. So thus he would have his patients lie back on a couch and relax, and he would let them talk freely. Of course, he probably also used some cocaine in there, but let's, that was one of the things he did. But not everybody did that. So he did popularize the idea of just talking. During the Victorian era, sexuality was a very taboo topic. Freud believed that a lot of problems were the result of repression around sexuality. Thus, he put an emphasis on the unconscious mind. So, like I said, a lot of people, they had a hard time talking about these things, especially about sexual abuse. And so they would put it in the unconscious mind and repress it. But they would come out. Things like this come out eventually. So his free association helped people to be able to talk freely. Freud's concept of defense mechanisms were about how the unconscious mind would keep the mind from being fully aware of things that could cause anxiety or shame. So if they had a hard time talking about it, about something, they would use these defense mechanisms. So we talk about psychoanalysis, but another method of looking at consciousness is Gestalt therapy. Remember, Gestalt therapy was a humanistic method, an experiential and a humanistic method that rose in reaction to psychoanalysis. They didn't like the negative approach of psychoanalysis, and yet they still looked at consciousness as well. Gestalt therapy was founded by Fritz Perls based on the principles of Gestalt psychology, and it mixed with it humanism and principles about awareness drawn from Zen Buddhism. So Zen Buddhism, is very interested in awareness as well. And so that's where Fritz Perls was able to mix a lot of these things together. So Gestalt therapy helps patients to really focus on the present moment, to pay attention to what they're aware of, and it helps them to heighten their consciousness about themselves and the people around themselves. But it also looks at blocks to consciousness. Gestalt therapy has a similar approach to Freud's defense mechanisms, though it's more focused on how people have awareness through contact with others. So psychoanalysis was just a unidirectional way approach. It took the stance that the therapist is the expert and the patient is just the patient. Whereas in Gestalt therapy, the therapist tries to take a more humble, dialogical approach, meaning that they see themselves not so much as an expert, but simply somebody who's trying to have contact with another person. So they will use themselves in the therapy process. So they're interested in how the other person has contact with people. And so, while psychoanalysis tends to focus on the past, Gestalt therapy looks at how contact is blocked in the present. So does that make sense? So psychoanalysis is focused on past experiences, whereas Gestalt is interested in the contact and consciousness in the moment. So how are people able to have full consciousness of the other person and make direct contact with people in the present moment? So Gestalt therapy has a more detailed process of how people make contact with others in order to get their needs met. This process can be interrupted at any point along the way. So that process it goes from sensing one's needs to mobilizing for action to taking action and getting needs met into withdrawing. Let me show you a diagram that shows this. So this is the contact process. It helps people get to their needs met, but this can be interrupted along the way. So the first step is sensation in Gestalt therapy. So the idea is that we sense something, we may sense our hunger, or we may sense being cold, but essentially we gain information through our senses. The next thing is awareness. And so, as we've said before, sensation leads to awareness. And so awareness is about paying attention to our senses. Now, we can have blocks along the way. Like, so a challenge for sensation would be desensitization, meaning we're not feeling our senses. And then the challenge of awareness is when we deflect away from that awareness. So we don't want to pay attention to the senses. We don't want to be aware. The next thing is mobilization. So when we're aware of something, like we're hungry, then we mobilize for action. A challenge for that would be introjection, where we tell ourselves we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that. So we stuff it and we don't do anything about it. That would be introjection. But that is where our mobilization gets interrupted. The next step, of course, is action. So we're mobilized. We build up our energy to go get our needs met. Maybe it's to get food or maybe turn the temperature up. So we take action. But an obstruction of this would be projection, whereas rather than us doing what we need to do, we displace that action to something else. And so that would be an example of that. Then there's contact. So we make contact with the thing that we need our needs met from. Like, for example, if it's from a relationship and you want to have an intimate connection with somebody, maybe you might take action, but then ultimately your goal is to have some kind of psychological contact with that person. And a challenge to that would be called retroflexion, whereas rather than making contact, we turn away from that. And then once our needs are met, then we have the feeling of satisfaction. The opposite of that, or challenge to that satisfaction, would be egotism. And then lastly, once our needs are met and we feel satisfied, we withdraw. And so this is a normal process. In Gestalt therapy, we're not always in contact with others. We have a natural back and forth. And so, that is normal. It's normal to have movement in our relationships. We're not always together. We're not always apart. But with that being said, we need to withdraw at some point. We can't just have contact. We also have to have withdrawal. So an obstruction to withdrawal would be confluence. And so that would basically mean we're stuck. We're enmeshed with somebody else, or we have confluence. So all these things are a normal process, a normal part of the awareness process, or the process of being fully conscious and interacting with the world around us. At any point along the way, this can be obstructed. We can have a block to contact and awareness. And like Freud called it defense mechanisms, Gestalt therapists would simply call these blocks to contact. Now, all of these are, it's important to be able to talk about things that are traumatizing, or, talk about things that prevent us from being able to be fully aware. But what really is the key is the integration of everything. It used to be believed, for example, that simply allowing people to talk about trauma or vent would give them opportunities to heal. For example, I've studied psychodrama, and there used to be this belief that if we get out a bat, or a pillow, we could beat something, and we could get all the anger out, and it would make us feel better. But we discovered, though, that it didn't help. In fact, it just made people sometimes feel worse. So what we now know that talking about something that's traumatic can actually simply just re-traumatize people. Rather, the key is integrating. And that is, integration occurs when we accept the part of ourselves or the memories that we've repressed and bring it into conscious awareness. And that's what the purpose of Gestalt therapy is about too. It's about really allowing us to accept all parts of ourselves, not judging it, and then allowing us to integrate it into ourselves. And so it no longer has power over us. So, if we feel shamed because we did something bad, we acknowledge it. This is what we did. And we accept that as part of ourselves. And that way we no longer, it's not something we have to repress anymore. As an example, I used to feel really bad about being angry. And so I would try to repress my feelings of anger when somebody hurt me. But then a therapist said, well, what is wrong with being angry? And I thought, well, no, you can't get angry. Good Christians aren't supposed to be angry. And he laughed. I said, really? And that goes along with that's called an introjection, where you don't allow yourself to accept something because you believe you ought to be a certain way, and so we don't accept that part of ourselves. But I've come to realize that no, anger is a normal part of our human experience. And so rather than repressing it, I need to be fully aware of it. That way I know how to deal with it. And so it's integration that helps us to be able to move beyond it. So let's talk about how we apply these things. First of all, so we talked about the difference between awareness and consciousness. So again, awareness is paying attention to our senses, whereas consciousness is organizing that in information and being, and doing something about it and integrating them together. Consciousness and awareness are, like I said, they're synonymous, but they have nuanced differences. Consciousness is a psychology of awareness. Awareness has to do with paying attention to our senses, while consciousness is more intentional about paying attention to what we perceive, and it's about integrating them. I think that's the key that I want to add here. Consciousness is about the integration of our awareness. Okay? And one can be, like I said, one can be aware but not fully conscious. So consciousness should lead us to greater awareness. Once we discover something about us, then we want to pay attention to it. And so awareness is a prerequisite to consciousness. Now, there's some implications of all this. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, are we paying attention? Are we paying attention to our pain? Or are we simply just trying to ignore it and repress it? Are we paying attention to what really drives us? Or again, are we trying to ignore it and repress it? Are we paying attention to what our needs are, what we need from people? Or do we think we ought to not feel that, and we try to repress it for some reason? Are we paying attention to our loved ones? And a challenge to that, if we're not, is then we're focused on ourselves. That would be egotism, where we're paying attention only to ourselves. Are we paying attention to people around us? Are we so focused on ourselves that we lose contact with people around us? Full consciousness allows us to be in contact with other people. And so are we learning to live in the real world, or are we living in a fantasy world? Are we living out our fantasies in the worlds we've constructed in our imaginations? So all these things, this is what really having consciousness is about. It's being fully alert, aware of ourselves and others, and it's integrating all aspects of ourselves. Now, there's ethical implications when we think about how people misuse, altered states of consciousness. Some people want to use substances or mental strategies to seduce or manipulate someone to get what they want. But, this is unethical and it's ineffective. The reality is you cannot manipulate consent. You can't force someone to consent. Otherwise, it's not like consent. And why would you want to be in a relationship with somebody who doesn't want to be there? Unfortunately, a lot of us try. We try to force people to be in relationships with us. But that's not loving and it's not caring. It's about you, not about the other person. So, but the other thing is, why not try what is even more effective? Getting to know people and learning what they want. So rather than using some script or pickup strategy or something like that to manipulate people to do what you want, why not find out what they want and find an alignment. And that will actually be more effective, and you'll get their consent, and they'll be happy. You'll be happy and they're happier. Why I can't understand how people would be happy when they have other people doing things against their will. That's just unfathomable. So that brings us to the subject of Ellen White. She actually talks a lot about the subject of mesmerism and hypnosis and some of the implications, ethical implications of it. She writes that for thousands of years, Satan has been experimenting upon the properties of the human mind, and he's learned to know it well. By his subtle workings in these last days, he's linking the human mind with his own, imbuing it with his thoughts, and he's doing this work in so deceptive a manner that those who accept his guidance know not that they are being led by him as well. So again, they're under a hypnotic trance of the devil. The great deceiver hopes so to confuse the minds of men and women that none but his voice will be heard. Satan is continually seeking to influence human minds by his subtle arts. So this is these strategies to manipulate people. He is a mastermind, given of God, but prostituted with all its noble capabilities to oppose and to make of no effect the counsels of the Most High. In these days when skepticism and infidelity so often appear in scientific garb. Now it's interesting, she's not knocking science, okay? What she is saying is that these are pseudosciences, okay? So, which is, I would agree, a lot of these things like mesmerism, NLP, pickup strategies, they're pseudoscience. They look like they're in a scientific garb, but they're not. And she would say, we need to be guarded on every hand. And I said this before, those things that are scientific generally are going to be good for us, whereas those things that are non-scientific generally have an ulterior motive or an agenda that is against us. So she writes, through this means our great adversary is deceiving thousands and leading them captive according to his will. The advantage he takes of the sciences which pertain to the human mind, is tremendous. Here, serpent-like, he imperceptibly creeps in to corrupt the work of God. This entering in of Satan through the sciences is well devised. Through the channel, and so here's the thing, she says, through the channel of phrenology, psychology, and mesmerism. Now here, it's interesting, she talks bad about psychology, but you have to understand that psychology meant something different in her day. Sigmund Freud hadn't even come along, or he came in just after she was alive. And so and even Freud's early stuff was all about hypnosis and was very pseudoscience too, as we've talked about before. So pretty much early psychology pretty much was pseudoscientific. So that's what she's attacking. So let's talk about this. If we look at some of the details, this is what the editor of Mind, Character, Personality writes in hindsight, just to kind of clarify. And I really like what the editors write. This is really from Dr. Cannon. He writes, in this statement, as published in the Signs of Times, 1884, Mrs. White drew heavily from and somewhat clarified a statement that was published originally in the Review and Herald. And she writes, the reference to phrenology, the editors write, the reference to phrenology, psychology, and mesmerism, as here combined, describing the manner in which Satan takes advantage of the human mind, may seem a bit obscure to one not familiar with the literature of the time and its emphasis. Scientific works devoted to physiology and the care of the sick carried advertising lists at the back informing the public of literature available. So here's what the literature of the time says. One such work, the Water Cure Manual, which was published in 1850 by Fowlers and Wells, carries a list of 65 different works on physical and mental health. And of these, 23 are devoted to phrenology, psychology, mesmerism, and clairvoyance. So we reproduce a few items here. So in that day, pseudoscience was predominant in the fields of psychology. And so that was pretty much that's all people had back then. So this is what they advertise in that time. $12 12 cents, you can get elements of animal magnetism or process and practical applications for relieving human suffering. They use animal magnetism. Familiar lessons on phrenology and physiology. Muslin in 1 volume, beautifully illustrated. Or fascination, or the philosophy of charming. It's basically charm magic. And this was associated with magnetism, illustrating the principles of life. Lectures on the philosophy of mesmerism and clairvoyance with instructions and its process and practical applications. Then here's one, Psychology or the Science of the Soul with engravings of the nervous system. Okay, so not bad, except that calling it Science of the Soul sounds kind of shady. Phrenology in the scriptures. Interesting, showing their harmony. So here's somebody who actually believed in phrenology and scripture. And lastly, philosophy of electrical psychology. Well, that's interesting. What is electrical psychology? In Dr. Sylvester Graham's 650-page lectures on the science of human mind, with a biographical sketch of the author, many of the same works are advertised, this time grouped and placed under such headings as Works to Phrenology, Hydropathy or Water Cure, Mesmerism Psychology, etc. In connection with the 8-page account of the life of Sylvester Graham, nearly a full page is devoted to phrenological description. So they really believed in phrenology back then. So thus Ellen White was writing of matters which at that time were very much before the public. So that's what the editors were making note of. This was the time period in which she wrote. So let's go back to what she wrote. She writes, this entering in of Satan through the sciences is well devised through the channel of phrenology, psychology, and mesmerism. He comes more directly to the people of this generation and works with that power which is to characterize his efforts near the close of probation. The minds of thousands have thus been poisoned and led into infidelity. While it's believed that one human mind so wonderfully affects another, Satan, who is ready to press every advantage, insinuates himself and works on the right hand and on the left. And while those who are devoted to these sciences laud them to the heavens because of the great and good works which they affirm are wrought by them, they little know what a power for evil they are cherishing. But it is a power which will yet work with all signs and lying wonders, with all deceivableness of unrighteousness. Mark the influence of these sciences, dear reader, for the conflict between Christ and Satan is not yet ended. Neglect of prayer leads men to rely on their own strength and opens the door to temptation. In many cases, the imagination is captivated by scientific research, and men are flattered through the consciousness of their own powers. The sciences which treat of the human mind are very much exalted. They are good in their place, but they are seized upon by Satan as his powerful agents to deceive and destroy souls. Now, just a reminder, she seems to be referring to this vitalist idea that we have some magical power or energy, and that was debunked, of course. And another thing that she also seems to be referring to is this idea of using our strength. You know, this goes back to this what I was talking about with integration. You know, if you're simply just trying to use these methods for the in of themselves, as if these methods are going to change people, without really doing the soul-searching work of changing our thoughts and behavior, then you really haven't done anything. You know, so his arts, Satan's arts, are accepted as from heaven, and he thus receives the worship which suits him well. The world, which is supposed to be benefited so much by phrenology and animal magnetism, never was so corrupt as now. Through these sciences, virtue is destroyed and the foundations of spiritualism are laid. So again, going back to that vitalism idea, there's they were connected to spiritualism, as we've seen in the New Age movement. And we still see a lot of these popular ideas and pseudosciences as well. You know, people have sought, let's just recap the main point of this, just kind of bring it all together. People have sought to enter into altered states of consciousness for thousands of years, primarily for the purpose of contacting God or spirits and for healing purposes. However, much of these practices are unscientific and ineffective and raise ethical considerations. Nevertheless, there may be some limited uses of dissociative states in the treatment of trauma. However, the key is in integrating and accepting those repressed memories and parts of ourselves into our normal consciousness and learning to deal with it rather than trying to use some shortcuts. There's no shortcuts to life. I hope that's the takeaway we can take away from all this. There are no shortcuts. It just takes hard work. Now, there's sometimes we can do things to help alleviate the pain, but we still have to integrate our thoughts, and we have to figure out ways to coping with stress and trauma. So I hope that you can join us in the next chapter as we continue on, chapter 18, Ways to Raise Awareness. We're going to talk about ways we can be proactive in raising our consciousness. Thank you for joining us.